Okay, thanks so much. Hi, everybody. Delighted to be here today. So I'm just going to do kind of a quick tour, give you some ideas, but then in the Q&A or a coffee, if there's anything I can help anybody with more than that, then feel free. So the broad structure of what I'm going to talk to you about today is why citizens' assemblies. So Eve obviously talked to you a bit about that, but I just briefly give you some of the context in Ireland about why we first went in this direction. A little bit about the topics. We've done a large number of topics, as you'll see. A little bit about kind of connections with politicians and policymakers, what's hard, what's easier, and then a little bit about kind of connections with the mass public and the mass media. So that's my my broad structure today. So the first part is, why citizens' assemblies in Ireland. So the background in Ireland, as in I think in so many other countries, was essentially one of crisis. So after the 2008 recession, which hit obviously all European countries, Ireland was one of the group of so-called pigs: Portugal, Ireland, Greece, Spain, and Italy, where the Troika came in. So the IMF and the World Bank came in to run the economy, and the local politicians didn't really have much policy-making input. Everybody's salary was cut. Large number of people were unemployed. The housing market crashed. It was a very difficult time. People were out on the streets, and the government didn't have much policy-making input. There wasn't much they could do. So a group of political scientists, myself and several colleagues, David Farrell and others, started a thing called political reform, where we talked about, well, why was Ireland one of the pigs? And one of the things was that our policy making was so centralised, and really that the government listened all the time to vested interests, so to bankers, to builders, but not to citizens. So we said, look, one of the things is, the government should start listening to citizens and putting citizens' interests ahead of the interests of the usual stakeholders and vested interests that have been very much part of policy making at that point. So we got funding. So this doesn't meet Eve's thing of connection with policymakers in the beginning, because of course we had huge resistance. So we got funding from a philanthropist, Chuck Feeney from Atlantic Philanthropy. So he was an American billionaire who made all of his money out of duty free. But he was spending it on universities and early childhood and basically progressive causes. So he gave us the money. And we said, look, you need to trust the people, you need to be able to listen to them. And our critics, who, as Eve alluded to, were mostly all of the political journalists, a lot of the politicians, a lot of civil society were very against us. I was in a TV studio one night, and I had one of the senior kind of political reporters shouting at me about American billionaires funding us, and we Irish could look after ourselves, and all of this kind of thing. And they said, we already have a citizens' assembly. It's called the Parliament. Or you can't trust people. It'll be the crazy people with green biros who are going to turn up. Or maybe those sensible Canadians and Dutch people can do it, because they'd already done it about electoral reform. But Irish people are mad. They drink too much. They'll never get anything sensible out of Irish people. All of these kind of reasons. But we said no. We need to have these randomly selected citizens. And what's really important is that when they come, they need to be representing themselves, their families, not be representative of some group. Not be, I'm here because I'm part of a green collective, or I'm here because I'm part of some youth group, So we tried it. We brought together these 100 people here with this money from the philanthropists. We used a polling company to get them. Since then, we've started using postal recruitment, and that's actually much better than a polling company, personal letters. But they came and they talked about tax and spending, and that was really difficult in Ireland at that time because taxes were going up and spending was going down because the IMF was running the economy, right? But they made quite nuanced judgments about which taxes they would like to pay more, okay? Which spending they were willing to cut. And so actually the politicians couldn't believe that citizens could actually listen and make those kind of trade-offs and kind of go, this is the kind of tax that we're willing to pay, this is the one we don't like paying, you know, this is the spending we're willing to cut, but not this. So they didn't want to cut education spending, but they were quite willing to cut central government services, you know, so there was different things like this. So this led, and I'll talk a bit about this when I go through the bit on kind of connections with policymakers, but it was influential. So the parties then had, well, actually, I put it back here. Oh, no, I don't have it there. So the parties all put then sections on political reform into their manifestos in the 2011 election. Because remember, again, there was very little that they could do. So political reform was something that they could promise. Okay, the people were really against the politicians, so promising to reform themselves was a way to get votes. And then, of course, in coalition negotiation, like most European countries, you get bits from everybody's manifestos in the coalition. They'd all promise some sort of citizens' assembly. And so as a result, we got a citizens' assembly. So we had the first one, it was called the Convention on the Constitution from 2012 to 2014. And its most famous case was probably marriage equality. So we became the first country to vote by popular vote for marriage equality. Then the next one, the Citizens' Assembly in 2016 to 2018, was where we got rid of the ban on abortion. So we legalized abortion in the Constitution. That's the case study up here. But there was also, it was the first Citizen Assembly on climate change in Europe as well. A short one. Then in 2020 to 2021, we did one on gender equality because we have, our Constitution was written in the 1930s and there's dreadful provisions like a woman's place is in the home, okay? And then in 2022, so at the moment we've just finished one on local government in Dublin, and there's a really nice one on biodiversity happening, and also one from about children in biodiversity, which is really cool and nice. But there's all sorts of different issues, and I can talk to people about this. So some of these led to referendums. This is an easier choice sometimes than when you're trying to push something through legislation, but others were legislation. Some of them with polling company recruitment, others postal recruitment. I would definitely recommend postal when you have the experience of both. Some of them were broad issues and some were narrow. So there's lots of lessons from them that I'll go through. So the first thing is which topics are suited. So you can have very detailed topics like electoral reform. So these were some of the first citizens' assemblies in British Columbia, Ontario, the Netherlands. But like in British Columbia, the citizens were there for 8 months learning about electoral systems before they did it. Like, wow, you know what I mean? They all could have written a PhD on electoral systems by the time they were finished. So it was kind of insane, you know? And really, really detailed. Then you have kind of moral and social issues. So in Ireland, you know, we've had marriage equality, we've had abortion, we've had gender equality, blasphemy, all of these kind of issues, mostly because these are in our Constitution because it's from the 1930s. So to be updated, we have to address all of these issues. And then there's kind of policy and those sort of issues. So we have climate and biodiversity, and then obviously that's where a lot more has been happening. So, you know, as part of the advisory group of the climate one in Scotland, for example, that I'm sure Kelly would talk to you about tomorrow, there's one in England that the Houses of Westminster ran. And I think there's really, and then the French one. And I think the most interesting lesson for me actually about all of those climate ones is the extent to which they did or didn't actually lead to changes in climate legislation. So the extent to which their policies their recommendations were actually implemented. So, for example, in England, they had a gorgeous assembly, really nicely run. David Attenborough, who, sure even people, did the opening. There was lovely media about it. But it was just some committees in Parliament who did it, nothing to do with the executive, to Boris Johnson at the time in Downing Street. And so Johnson and his team never talked about it. Whereas in Scotland, the Parliament and the government were more involved, and so it had more of an output. In France, it was very much Macron's personal kind of vision, and it wasn't really in the Parliament in France, and therefore Macron could just ignore a lot of the recommendations of the Climate Assembly. So I think when you look at the differences between the climate assemblies, really who was involved politically and what it is that they've said they're going to do, as Eve was saying, that's the really crucial thing, looking at those from as far as I can see. So in terms of general framing, it's this is actually an old version of my slides because it's a PDF. I had updated it. But it's much easier to frame it on values. So frame it on things that people feel themselves anyway, that they can talk to their families about, that they might talk about in a coffee shop or in a bar, and where there's clear choices. When you're trying to talk about something like electoral systems, it's really difficult because except for if you're talking about first past the post versus proportional representation, then you can talk about values, equality, one person, one vote, and all of this kind of thing. But when you really get into the intricacies of whether you're going to go for mixed member proportionality or single transferable votes or all of this kind of thing, it becomes really difficult for people to relate that to kind of values and make clear choices. I also think it's better to go narrower. So some assemblies start off really broad, like what's our future? There's no choice there about what's our future. What choice are you going to make there? Okay, so you need to have something where people can actually talk about a choice. We can say, well, I like this versus I like that, because nobody's going to stand up and say, well, I want an unequal society, and I want it to be non-inclusive, and I want it to be non-participative, and somebody else stands on the other side and I want an equal, inclusive, participative. That's not a real choice. So you need to have something where people can actually make choices. The other thing that I've seen a lot in a lot of ours and elsewhere is this choice about time for evidence versus time for deliberation. And like the inclination of people designing these things is, the citizens need to know so much. So we need to have all of these experts come in and tell them all of this. And they're so busy pumping information into people that they forget that the people need time to deliberate, time to talk to each other. So you'll see the very nice balance that you all have in this room that even the FITE team have designed, where you have almost as much time for, or if not more time for deliberation, as somebody like me trying to fill your head with information. And for, ordinary citizens, this is really important. They really need that time to build the bonds. So you have to step back from the inclination of so many designers to just pump in more information, okay? More is not necessarily good at all in this type of thing. The other thing is different types of evidence. So in Ireland, we're very clear now that we have experts. So we have somebody like me who's a professor in something and stands up and goes, blah, 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 okay? And half the people go, I didn't finish my school, never mind go and do an undergraduate degree in university. Who's this person? I don't relate to them at all, okay? So it's very important to also have people's personal experiences. So, when we looked at abortion, we had women in the room who'd had very difficult pregnancies where a baby was dead and they had to travel to England to have the abortion, and they stood up very bravely and told their story and their personal experience of this. But in climate, we also had farmers stand up and say, this is what it's going to mean for my family if they're, if we cut the number of cows, okay? We already exist on a very small amount of income. If we cut the number of cows, this is really going to impact my family, my neighborhood. Already our village is subject to a lot of emigration. So people listen to other people's experiences as well as the expert evidence. So I think it's a mistake to just focus on the expert evidence. And then the newest thing that we've started doing, which seems to be going really well, is actually experiential learning. So in the biodiversity assembly at the moment, for example, there's 2 biodiversity assemblies. So one is for over 18s, which is the national one, and one is for, I said to Kelly earlier, it's 5 to 17, but it's actually 6 to 17-year-olds. But the idea there is they actually go out and they look at areas with great biodiversity, where there's lots of plants, where things are being managed really well, and then they go to wastelands where there's just fir trees and nothing growing underneath them, or urban places, so they learn by seeing and doing, because of course all of us as humans have different ways that we learn, and different types of learning engage different parts of our brain. So I think it's really important. It seems to be really nice to, you know, get out of the classroom environment, get out of the hotel room, which is where we usually are, for lots of different types of learning. And the same thing with, in the first assemblies, we gave people all this reading. So they had like death by PowerPoint, you know, 10 PowerPoint presentations to read on the train on their way up to the deliberation. It was insane. Like only the most nerdy could possibly do it, okay? And the rest just didn't. So now, and the Scottish did this really well, actually made some really nice videos about climate and everything that were really kind of shareable, that people could really relate to. There was, you know, really nice production values. They were really well done. So I think that kind of video evidence is really good. So it's just remembering that everybody is so different. And then probably the biggest challenge actually is that we say that if you're doing a presentation, it must be at the level of a 14-year-old, okay? So where a 14-year-old's level of literacy. You can have papers that are more detailed that you give to people afterwards, but it must be okay for everybody in the room. And so you assume kind of 14-year-old literacy. And that's the most difficult for my colleagues, you know, trying to get professors to, you know, they just still have 20 million words on PowerPoints and things, you know, and but that's, I think, really important to be inclusive. Otherwise, you're excluding people who don't have as much formal education as the people in this room, you know, and it's really important not to do that, you know. And then, I won't bother with those. Okay, so, oh yeah, well, that was so there we are. We brought them off to Bull Island, which is an area of kind of nature conservation and so on. But the important thing there is vested interests. We're really clear that whether you're a member of XR or you're a member of the Catholic Bishops' Conference of Ireland, okay, you're an interest. You're not an expert. We don't consider you an expert. So we say to the citizens, you know, here is the experts, and they either give both sides of an argument, or if they're known for just being on one side, they're balanced by an expert on the other side. But if they're part of a lobby group, it doesn't matter what that lobby group is. We say these people are vested interests. They're part of a lobby group. It's important to hear what they say, but we know who they are. So, for example, on abortion, we had one session with a big long table at the front of and it is like a wedding, because it's actually in a big hotel in Dublin where people do have their weddings. So they are sitting at round tables, and there is all of that. And so the big top table where normally the bride and groom and their family are in Irish weddings, were all of our interests. So at one end here, we had Colin O'Gorman, who's head of Amnesty International in Ireland. He's a gay man who has 2 adopted children. And at the other end, we had the Catholic Bishops' Conference and the Knights of Columbanus, who are 2 very conservative Catholic organizations who were very against the idea of marriage equality. But they were all interests, so they all got up to stand and say what they did, but none of them got to kind of present on their own. But what the interesting thing was, like what Colin and the other kind of activists from Amnesty and other places learned in that marriage equality one, in the beginning, they were really against it. So they were some of the people trying to lobby the government and say, please don't put marriage equality to a citizen assembly, God knows what those citizens will do. You know what I mean? We've been campaigning on this for 20 years. They could turn it all back. You know, they could do anything. But what they learned from actually being there was that it was really powerful having ordinary people speak. So, for example, they found 2 young adults, 2 siblings whose mothers were lesbian, and they talked about how they were like really nervous of if one of their mothers got sick, who wasn't their biological mother, they wouldn't have the right to go into hospital or to do any of these things, whereas the other one, and this really affected the people in the room, you know, when they could relate to this real family kind of scenario. So what the people like Amnesty learned from that was actually what they needed to do was put more real people, real stories, real experiences, and they carried that into their campaigns for equality and so on afterwards in the referendums. But they were clearly there as an interest, not as an expert, you know, even though they were Amnesty International. So then I said I'd talk to you a bit about connections with policymakers. So the very first one, there's a much younger me, that's David Farrell, who's a professor in UCD in Dublin, one of my colleagues. And in the middle is actually a woman who should get an awful lot more credit than she usually does, called Caroline Erskine. And for anybody at the very beginning of this kind of process in their country, somebody like Caroline is actually really essential. So it was Atlantic Philanthropies who suggested to us we needed somebody like Caroline. So Caroline had been a political correspondent in Irish National Radio, RTE. So she knew all of the journalists and she knew all of the senior politicians. She could pick up a phone to any of them and have coffee or have lunch. So she was really key in sort of saying to people, look, it's not that mad. Give them a chance. You know, have a look at the report. And then afterwards, you know, when we did the report, we brought it into all the politicians and showed them, look, Irish people aren't that mad. They can actually do this thing, okay? So it was really important to have somebody like Caroline on our team. And the other person was a guy called Fiach McNeill, who was the head of our National Theatre. So he was a brilliant performer, but he was kind of the chairman of it. But again, he was kind of apolitical, but he knew everybody. He was well respected in a lot of elite policy-making circles and things. So it was really good in this first one to have people like Caroline and Fiach on our team. Then in the second one, now at this stage, the government had actually set this up, the Convention on the Constitution, okay? But what they decided was that 1/3 of the members were going to be politicians. So we had 66 citizens and 33 politicians in this assembly. Now, a lot of people were really, really nervous about this. You know, the politicians are professional communicators. They're going to dominate all the table discussions. You know, we're never going to be able to get anywhere with it. But actually, it was Ken Carty who Eve chatted about at the last assembly. Ken had been very much as well part of us. Ken had written a book about Irish politics, and everybody always thinks anybody who writes about Irish politics who isn't Irish is fabulous. So we brought Ken in to, you know, talk about the possibility of sortition to all the politicians before this. But Ken said, no, this is actually really good because for a first time, because what went wrong in British Columbia is that they had this fabulous sortition, this amazing process. Citizens spent 8 months learning about electoral systems, really did an awful lot of very detailed work. It went to referendum and it was defeated. Why? Because the politicians imposed a supermajority, because they didn't like it, and because they campaigned against it. And the reason they did that is they didn't feel the connection with it, okay? The Assembly in British Columbia had done everything they could to keep themselves pure, to keep themselves insulated from political influence because it was such a political topic. And as a result, the politicians hadn't bought in at all. So Ken said, no, this will be good to have the 33 politicians in the room. And it turned out he was right. So I'll be able to show you some of the evidence. But what it meant was that there were very senior politicians in the room at different times, like the Minister for Justice, the Minister for Foreign Affairs. Jerry Adams was there, if any of you know him from Sinn Féin. Mary Lou MacDonald, who's the current leader. So very, very serious, very senior politicians were in that room. But the amazing thing was, at the round tables, they pretty much shut up and just talked when they were invited in, okay? Now, what we had is not just facilitators, but we had facilitators and note takers. So the note taker was there to write down like how much everybody was speaking and when they were speaking and all of that, which freed up the facilitator to just facilitate. So obviously that's a budgetary thing, but if you have the budget for it, I'd highly recommend it. But we found that, and I'll show you some of the evidence, that the politicians didn't dominate. Now, as soon as, like when you go to plenary sessions, so in an Irish assembly, if this were an Irish assembly now, right now the TV camera would be there and it would be on, right? And you would see me speaking, you would see all of you sitting there. The people who are really shy would be put at these sides of the tables, so you just see the backs of their heads. The others can be on the other sides of the tables. Then when you start talking to each other, like you're going to do soon, the TV camera goes off. That's when the politicians behaved. And then afterwards, when you have your Q&A, the TV camera comes back on. So of course, no politician can resist a TV camera, so they all get up and talk and dominate the plenary sessions. So there's a trade-off, you know. But it did build trust. It meant that they were on the inside. They could see how it worked. They could see that it wasn't manipulated in one direction. They felt they had some ownership of it. So I think that really helped with kind of getting more of it in Ireland, was actually having them in the room. So the way they moved afterwards when we went to abortion is, for the important ones, they set up special. They didn't come into abortion, I think, for two reasons. One, they already had trust because they'd been in marriage equality and all of those. There was 8 issues in the first one. But second of all, abortion was so toxic, and you know, they like really unpleasant mail, a lot of very unpleasant imagery, and you know, a lot of American pro-life activists put money and visits into Ireland to try to influence this. So it was pretty horrible tactics. So they didn't want to be in the room. So they set up a special all-party committee. And the only job of that committee, it was a new committee, the only job of that committee was to consider the report of the Citizen Assembly. So that committee took the report of the Citizen Assembly. They called a lot of the same people. They called some new people. They deliberated. They took 6 months to do that. So they could do it in even more depth than the Citizen Assembly could do. And then they issued their report about which parts of the assembly they agreed with, which parts they disagreed with, and what they wanted to do. And you know, they agreed with 90% of it, and then some bits they kind of wrote back on. But the same happened with climate change. There was an all-party committee on climate change after our climate assembly, and that led to, we followed Westminster into declaring a climate emergency. Ireland had been a climate laggard, like one of the, because the farming lobby is so strong in Ireland. And then for gender equality, the committee is sitting at the moment. So that's important. And then right now we're kind of back to the future. So with the Dublin one, which is just finished, they said, no, you had to have 17 local councillors in the mix. And I was on the advisory board, I can tell you that I don't think it worked. I don't think it was a good idea. And I'll show you why. It's because it was actually about their jobs. It wasn't about policy that wasn't theirs. It was actually about how they were going to be elected, how much money they were going to be paid, what sort of powers were they going to have. Okay, so I don't think this isn't then a deliberation which you can possibly expect them to enter into in good faith. It's not about, you know, what climate action will we take or how will we save biodiversity. So I don't think that worked at all. You can see them there. There's the chair of the assembly on the left outside the hotel, and there's all of the mayors lobbying him, okay? Because, of course, that's what they're going to do. So I won't go through this. This just is the stats to back up my thing, that politicians and citizens actually do deliberate well together. And And then just to say quickly then about the kind of links with the media. Because the first one was about marriage equality and that really mattered, the headlines went around the world. So it wasn't just Irish media, it was global media that were interested in that. So that really helped us. And I know that's difficult for others. And the same thing with abortion and with climate change and so on. So as a result, we have really high awareness about it. We have a lot of kind of media coverage. There's a lot of trust about it. So you can, I can talk more about how to actually deal with difficult journalists if anybody's interested. I started life as an economics editor, so I know what journalists are like. So I just finished up here. Eva's telling me it's time. So we're talking about where are we going to next? Since the awful invasion of Russia, Ireland is neutral. There's talk about that we should have an assembly now to consider Ireland's neutrality. So that will be politically contentious. There's one which I was talking to one of you about earlier, which is about a border poll in Northern Ireland, okay, which is about whether Northern Ireland should leave the UK and join the Republic, which is obviously very contentious. And then the last one is just yesterday, our Prime Minister went into that committee of the gender equality one and said that next year we will have a referendum to get rid of the controversial clause in the Constitution about a woman's place being in the home. So there we are.